first glance, I thought pretty easy. Go to church, don't swear. That's the end of it. And I thought a little bit further. Thought about it's more than just swearing. How important are names? What images are created when you hear certain names? Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Reagan, Adolf Hitler. What comes to mind when you hear the name Abraham Lincoln? How many images, connections, associations immediately come to your mind? If I were to speak Adolf Hitler, you think about certain points in history, certain events. Names are powerful. They have a big part of our identity. They tell our story. Our life is contained in them. Judas Iscariot bears a name with a story. Obviously, there's great power in names. They reflect a myriad of images and ideas in our minds. They identify certain traits and characteristics. In some cases, we bear a name and it gives us power, and we can bear a name and it can bring shame on that person or the family. When the third commandment says, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, it's not speaking about those only who use God's name in cursing. It is speaking about God's people failing to represent His name correctly by their lifestyle. Almost like an ambassador represents his people. The Bible teaches us that we reflect the name of God to this world like ambassadors. And failure to represent Him faithfully in the way that we live or speak means misusing the Lord's name. Exodus 27, we have a responsibility of His name. Israel had been asked to accept God's name. They were called by name, says the Lord. To bear His name was also to accept a responsibility to represent His name to the world. The point of this commandment is not to misuse His name by misrepresenting it to others. This is still true for those of us today who bear Christ's name as Christians. When Israel accepted God's covenant, they accepted responsibility to correctly represent Him to the world. They were not to be ashamed of His name. They were not to malign it either. They were to uphold His name, a people called by His name. Recently, in my trips to the doctor and other facilities, I read a magazine and had a story about a pastor's daughter. It's around graduation time. This daughter had been asked to give the prayer. Then she was asked to give the closing prayer. Then she was asked to admit Christ's name in her closing prayer, lest someone of other faiths be offended. She replied that she would be glad to admit Christ's name from her closing prayer, as long as the Jewish girl who was opening the ceremony in prayer would mention Christ's name, lest people of her faith would be offended. She was allowed to give her prayer as originally planned. She stood up. She held His name responsibly. God holds us responsible for the use or misuse of His name. God's name can literally be rebuked or revered on the basis of our life and lifestyle, the witness that we reflect in our life. If we get so offended by people using God's name loosely in conversation, maybe we should become a little bit more upset when we see Christians live or act in such a way that brings reproach on the name of Christ. A faithful believer can literally induce a sense of reverence for God's name in unbelievers if their life reflects this reverence in word and in deed. Most people won't curse around a real Christian if they know them for the way they are revealed and have revealed God in their life. If, however, we don't accurately reflect God in our lives, there's no amount of telling someone they can't curse that will stop them from cursing. I read somewhere once, maybe the priest can tell me who, said that the number one cause of atheism in Christians is Christians. Those who proclaim God with their mouth, but yet they deny Him their lifestyle, is what this unbelieving world finds simply unbelievable. Christians not living and bearing Christ in their lifestyle. Can you be identified by the blood you bear? Does the world clearly see God's name stamped in your life? Paul says that we have redemption through His blood, and therefore declare His grace and forgiveness even through the way we live. Jesus Himself taught His disciples to pray in this way: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed, holy be your name. We must not only pray that His name is holy, we must practice it. When we practice it, we preach it, and therefore properly represent God's name in the world. Then we will not be using the Lord's name in vain. The fourth commandment, in terms of seriousness, where would you rank this one? To be honest, it surely doesn't sound as serious as thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not commit adultery. God says, I want you to take it easy for a while. Remember me for about an hour on a Sunday. The rest of the day is yours. Think about this. In prison, you spend the majority of your time in a 10 by 10 cell. At work, you spend the majority of your time in an 8 by 8 cubicle. In prison, you get 3 free meals a day. At work, you get a break for 1 meal, and you have to pay for it. In prison, you get time off for good behavior. At work, you get more work for good behavior. In prison, the guard locks and unlocks all the doors for you. At work, you must carry the security card and open the doors for yourself. In prison, you can watch TV and play games. At work, you get fired for watching TV and playing games. In prison, you get your own toilet. At work, you share the toilet. In prison, you're allowed to have your family and friends visit. At work, you're not supposed to even speak to your family. In prison, all expenses are paid by a taxpayer with no work required. At work, you pay all your expenses, you go to work, and they deduct taxes from your salary to pay for those in prison. In prison, you spend most of your life inside bars, wanting to get out. At work, you spend most of your time wanting to get out to go inside bars. In prison, you must deal with sadistic wardens. At work, these are called bosses or managers. But yet people work and work and work. God wasn't joking with this commandment. Exodus 31, we see the penalty for breaking this commandment was death. If you don't stop and rest 1 day a week, you'll be put to death. I believe this puts it on the even playing field as thou shalt not murder or commit adultery. It's a serious commandment. The U.S. Army conducted a study where it observed several soldiers over various conditions to determine at what stage these individuals achieved the maximum level of output. They discovered that after 7 consecutive days of hard work, each soldier's performance dropped. This was not that big of a surprise, but what was interesting is even though the soldiers' performance dropped, the soldiers themselves were unaware of it. They thought they were still operating at maximum level. Maybe that's why so many of us think that we don't need rest, and somehow it's lazy to take a day off, because we don't realize we're not working at optimal performance. God knows the importance of rest. He made us. He knows how much we can handle. And He knows if we don't take time to recharge our batteries, refocus on Him who gave us life, then we will destroy ourselves. There are a lot of workaholics for different reasons. A lot of people find their identity with their job. They find their value in life with what they do. When you go into social gatherings, it's either the weather or what you do for a living. We should be identified by who we are. We are children of the King. Work is what we do with our hands and our brains, or a combination of both. So we all work. But that does not define us. There are others in this world who say, sure, I love work. I really love work. I could watch people do it for ages. Some people make it their goal in life to do as little as possible. To keep one day each week special, to remember God and to rest. Notice in the full commandment, it stresses that we must work hard for 6 days for the one. God is not glorified by Christians who slack and have no desire to work or pursue a career. He wants us to be representatives at work and home, wherever it is that you labor, whatever it is that God has called you to be. He wants you to work at it and be the best you can be. Work is your mission, and we all have been sent. So I say we need to be sly at work. We need to be the salt to make our workplace less rotten. Light to show God's glory, and yeast to quietly infiltrate and multiply God's grace throughout each of our individual fields. Sometimes it's hard to speak the gospel, but again, if you live the kind of life that you're supposed to live, then it'll be a little effort to proclaim the gospel. It's amazing how easy we tend to turn something that's meant for our benefit into something that's such an obligation. God says, work hard for 6 days, and then reflect on me, and I'm going to give you a day of rest. It's not a duty. It's not supposed to be a legalistic command. He gave it to us as a gift. But yet, so many of us take our church attendance and Sunday for granted. We don't have time for this. The work week's been so busy. We can squeeze a little bit more in. We often have things mismatched. When we come home from a busy week, many will ask themselves the question, shall I go to church today? It's been a really hard week. That's our mistake right there. We would do well to build it into our lives in such a way that we don't make a decision, should I go to church? It should not be a choice. It should be something you just do. we try to decide, especially in that moment, we'll play golf, we'll watch TV, we'll do this, we'll do that, instead of appreciating the Lord and what He has given us and truly resting from our labor. Now, I'm not saying to turn your attendance into a duty, still less a law, but I'm commending to you, take the choice away. If you love God and want to grow in your faith, just resolve that you're going. Take the choice away. Build a rhythm in your life. Make it a holy habit. The New Testament clearly says that we are not under the law. So when it comes to these commandments, the key issue is not following precise rules for what we can or cannot do, or saying the Lord's name or cursing it in a certain way. It's how we live our lives. Under this new covenant, God's laws should be written in our heart. They should become a heart attitude rather than ritualistic and legalistic rules. Will you represent His holy name in the world you live in? Will you keep holy the Sabbath day? How will you represent Christ after you leave St. Mike's?